The United States, a country which is known as the godfather of capitalism, is now a socialist state. My name is Kwame Gonza, and I'm glad you are here. This is Africa Reimagined. I'm a member of Connect Africa with my sister Mallet, and at the same time, I'm a member of the Africa Continental Unity Party. Now, the United States, which we all know as the country that has been pushing across the world cutthroat capitalism and imposing it on everyone, is implementing socialist policies, or what you would call state capitalism. The same policies that the United States and its institutions have been criticizing for decades. Let me take you through it. What I mean by the United States practicing state capitalism is the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, the so-called Chips and Science Act. These legislations, which were passed in Congress and were signed on by President Biden, they are purely a practice of state capitalism, whereby subsidies are given to companies for them to manufacture semiconductor chips. And on the other hand, when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act, there are subsidies given to companies which are engaged in the renewable energy industry. Now, this raises questions. Why has this country been pushing and blackmailing and even lying to majority of the African people and global South that they should push for capitalism? Privatization is the only way. This is what they have been saying to us for all these decades. And now, as if that is not enough, there is another ironic side to this situation. It is the African leaders themselves, the African heads of state. I would not call them leaders. The African heads of state, they blindly, up to now, in this information age, do not follow up to understand what is happening in the United States, what is happening in the world, even with this internet that has come to us. But instead, what you hear the African leaders saying, or the African heads of state saying, the private sector. You hear them, private sector. While the godfather of the private sector is practicing state capitalism, the African heads of state are still stuck onto the narrative of state capitalism. I mean, there's the narrative of the private sector, as we are going to see what majority of these heads of state, in their misguided way, are putting Africa into, or the trouble which they are putting Africa into.
But it's now clear that the private sector are the ones who can create wealth. This is not so simple because it's not so clear.
So this is the problem now which we have. This is an African heads of state. Now, as if that is not enough, I have another one. I have another African head of state talking about the private sector. The private sector. Like I said, Europe is protecting its industries. The United States is protecting its industries in its battle against China. the African heads of state have decided to remain asleep to this reality, and they are still continuing to push the false narrative of the private sector. While these countries who are pushing this false narrative of private sector are practicing state capitalism and in many cases socialism, because we saw the United States giving checks to its citizens during the COVID period. There is no single African citizen who got a check that our banks, our central banks in Africa, that they printed checks and gave to each of the African citizens. The United States got checks. The United States citizens got checks from the United States government. And as far as we are concerned, this is socialism. But anyway, the African heads of state are still saying the private sector. They are still hanging on, even though the so-called private sector, where it comes from, it is being dreaded, as we are seeing President Biden's policy of industrialization. But then I'll come back to that later. Let me first give you President Akufo-Addo with his false narrative also of the private sector.
President Akufo-Addo has held a breakfast meeting with selected chief executives at the Jubilee House in Accra.
The aim of the meeting is to involve the private sector in the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals (SDGs) by 2020. President Akufo-Addo urged them to prioritize the SDGs in their various outfits as well as in line of business. He described them as primary promoters of social and economic transformation who should play key roles in the implementation of the SDGs.
The breakfast meeting was organized to encourage the private sector to support efforts in achieving the SDGs. It was also to solicit ideas from them about how Ghana can be a leader in achieving the goals. The meeting brought together 40 CEOs from the private sector and selected public sector institutions for an interactive dialogue with the president. As co-chair of the group advocates of eminent persons of the UN SDGs, President Akufo-Addo says he takes the achievements of the SDGs very seriously, as it has a direct bearing on the development of Ghana and Africa as a whole. President Akufo-Addo said he wants to foster a strong partnership with the private sector to achieve his objective.
In today's world, the primary promoters of social and economic transformation. So if there's any important goal of a social or national nature which is going to be successfully addressed, it can only be so if one can challenge the private sector to participate in the process of addressing the issues. And that is essentially why I invited you to come around today. And today, what is it? I'm looking for ideas.
President.
Now, as you have heard, that is President Akufo-Addo of Ghana. Of course, the other was a president from East Africa. Now, this is the problem with the African heads of state. They are deliberately being misled by the West for years, for decades, for the last 6 decades of Africa's independence. And in turn, they have also come and continued. They have continued to mislead the African people and mislead the African continent. And we are asking ourselves, why has our continent not been growing for this long? And it's the private sector. Everything which you ask them is the private sector. Everything which you ask them, it is the private sector. So this has become a problem. This has become a problem. And now we are realizing that this false narrative that has been planted is not the one that is going to help our continent to develop. And that is why we, as the Africa Continental Unity Party, have come to decide to move in a different direction, to move the continent in a much different direction. We have decided to try to move the continent in a different direction. And that is why we are inviting you to come and join us. Come and join us in this journey as we charter a new way for the African continent. We are talking about reorganizing the African continent, rebuilding the African continent and its resources and its people. We have sectors which we are looking at. We have areas which we are looking at in reorganizing. Number one, reorganizing Africa's resources, material resources in the ground. Number two, the most important resource which Africa has, which is its human resource and population of 1.4 billion people, and with the literacy rate of more than 75%. The other resource which we know that we have is Africa's GDP of $3.5 trillion. Africa's GDP currently is at $3.5 trillion put together, which would make Africa the fifth or even the sixth biggest economy in the world. So this tells you that Africa does not need aid in this aspect. So like I mentioned, we as the Africa Continental Unity Party, we believe that we can reorganize these resources which have been misused by these exploiters, by these misleaders, by these people who are destroyers that have destroyed the continent and left it open for exploitation by external forces while they are concentrating on false narratives. We believe that they have to step aside. They have to step aside so that a new generation of Africans can take over the continent. And that is what the Africa Continental Unity Party represents. Come and join us in this journey. Now, let me move forward. This narrative, this false narrative of the private sector has been debunked by our ancestors long time. Long ago, it was debunked by people like Kwame Nkrumah. Long ago, it was debunked by people like Walter Rodney. Long ago, it was debunked by even people like Castro in Cuba. And yet the United States has put sanctions on Cuba because Cuba has been practicing socialist ideals. The United States has been criticizing China because China has been implementing socialist policies. Now, the United States itself is implementing the same thing and is not criticizing itself. The same things are being implemented in Europe. Yet Africa, they give it the wrong advice. It also buttresses the point which Professor Ha Jung Chang from Britain, who is a native in Britain but came from Korea, has been buttressing, or he buttressed in his book called Kicking Away the Ladder. In this book, he shows you that Britain, Europe, and the United States, including Japan and all the other countries like Singapore, they did not develop with the private sector. He pointed it out that they developed through protectionism, through capitalism. But that capitalism was state capitalism to a certain level. But even when they were starting out, it was pure state control of the economy, regulation, heavy regulation. But when they developed, after they had developed, then they started misleading the countries which came later, especially our countries which came after independence, after 1945. They started misleading our countries because they had already developed, simply because they wanted to have their capital go everywhere and exploit and extract resources from every part of the world. And this is what you see with the African heads of state, that they do not differentiate between capital, which is coming to extract and destroy your lands, and the capital, which is coming to help you to develop and improve the lives of your people. Hence, we see that the capital from the West has majorly been extractive capital, which destroys not only the environment in Africa, but impoverishes our people. And even when you look at the period in which we have been lied to that we should practice liberalization and privatization, our people did not have enough capital. And Nkrumah made this point very well in most of his work, that our people did not have enough capital. The only person, the only institution, the only body that had enough capital to invest on behalf of the people, it was the state. Now, for the West, they purposefully destroyed the African state and weakened the African state so that their own capital, when you are talking about the private capital, privatization, Africans did not have capital to come and invest in these institutions. So our institutions, which were built after independence, factories, all of them were collapsed deliberately. And of course, with the policy, with the fact that the West did not want Africa to have industries because Africa would use the raw materials which the West wanted. And these materials were present in Africa. Now, all our industries were bought by the West. Some of them collapsed. And the ones which are utilities, they have been taken over to feed the West. And Africa has been left in a position of perpetual poverty and a position of perpetual exploitation. And of course, until China came on the scene, when China developed rapidly. But even with that, because China doesn't interfere in how we conduct our affairs, we need to find a different direction. We need to find a different solution. We need to find a different approach. And that is where the Africa Continental Unity Party is coming in, to give us a new direction. And we must all work together. So Connect Africa, Africa Continental Unity Party, we are all working together towards this direction to find a new way for Africa. Now, this policy of state capitalism has especially come on board after Biden. But let me first take you back to Professor Ha-Joon Chang, and let us see what he is saying about the West. Let us see what he is saying about the West.
About the bank, and foreign shareholders were not even allowed to vote in the annual general shareholders meetings. You know, today, I mean, you go to Korea, you go to Mexico, there are a lot of foreigners who are the, I mean, CEOs, not to speak of board members of major banks. You know, another example of kicking the ladder is that today, if you go to the WTO and these international organizations, the Japanese government regularly submits this document saying regulation of foreign direct investment is bad for economic development. Hello, I mean, what did you do when you are developing? You know, you basically completely banned foreign direct investment. Finland classified all firms with more than 20% foreign ownership as dangerous enterprises. You know, I mean, Finns are not exactly the subtlest people in the world, but this was quite heavy stuff even from the Finns. Yeah? I mean, I haven't invented these words. These are official Finnish terms. Eh? Until the early 1980s, there was no foreign bank branch in Finland. In the early days of development, Germany and Japan used state-owned enterprises to kickstart industrialization in the key sectors. State-owned enterprises were extensively used in France, Finland, Austria, Norway, Taiwan, and Singapore. I already told you about Singapore in my first lecture on the nature of economics. 22% of GDP in Singapore is produced by state-owned enterprises. In Taiwan, 16% of GDP is from state-owned enterprises. All the French firms that you have ever heard of were either still significantly owned by the state or until recently were owned by the French state. It's actually quite amazing. Almost all sectors in which the US still has the international technological leadership are sectors that were created and promoted by the US military. Computer, internet, Google Maps, I mean, these were all based on technologies initially promoted by the Pentagon. Few people know this, but semiconductor, the sort of building blocks of the information economy, this was initially developed by the US Navy. The US would not have the leadership in aircraft industry without the subsidies and the procurement from the US Air Forces. In the pharmaceutical and biotechnologies, around 30% of research funding is given by the US federal government. If you just look at the statistics of state-owned enterprises, the US has a tiny state-owned enterprise sector accounting for only about 1% of GDP. So you might think, the US at the state doesn't really play an important role in the productive sector. But once you know, what it has done to promote the technologies, to establish new industries, you would not have the view.
So this is what we are talking about. So this is the point that we actually are making right now, that the United States is engaging in the same behavior of state capitalism, while abroad it is promoting private capitalism. Actually, this reminds me of what Martin Luther King Jr. said. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that America gives the poor, it forces capitalism on the poor and socialism for the rich, because the rich are always bailed out, while the poor are saying they should pull themselves by the bootstraps, and yet they don't even have the boots. The poor do not have the boots with which they should pull themselves up. So how do you tell them that they should pull themselves by the bootstraps? And the rich who already have, they are given more. So this is what he called capitalism for the poor and socialism for the rich. So to turn this around on the global stage is the same thing that the United States is practicing at home. It is practicing socialism at home, and then capitalism outside. It is forcing capitalism on the rest of the world. It is protecting its industries even to date. I wish that Professor Ha-Joon Chang was saying these things, that they are not even happening today. But today they are happening, like I mentioned before you. The Inflation Reduction Act, the Chips and Science Act, the checks which were given during the COVID period. This is all state capitalism or socialism. You can call it whatever you want. But this is socialism or state capitalism. And this is what it has been accusing China of. So what we are seeing is that this is absolute socialism, and this is absolute hypocrisy. Absolute hypocrisy. Now, let me take you to another gentleman. This is the gentleman who has crafted Biden's policy, Biden's economic policy. Biden's economic policy, which they are falsely calling Bidenomics. Okay? They are calling Biden's socialism, they are calling it Bidenomics. That is what they are calling it.
We have more to do, but inflation is now at its lowest point in 2 years. In fact, we have the lowest rate of inflation among the world's major economies. No other major economy in the world is inflation as low as we are. It's down from 9% to 3%. There's a lot more work to do. I'm not satisfied with where it is. More work ahead. The Washington Post recently suggested in the front page article, I think it's front page, that, quote, Republicans may have to find something else to criticize Biden for now that inflation is coming down. I'm sure they'll find something. At the same time, pay for low-wage workers has grown at the fastest pace in over 2 decades, and wages are growing faster than inflation. We're continuing to make progress in fixing the supply chain. For example, we couldn't access semiconductors during the pandemic because the factories making them overseas were shut down. You all know semiconductors are those little small computer chips about the size of any of a fingertip that effectively everything in our lives, from cell phones to automobiles, refrigerators, to the most sophisticated weapon system, including the systems that Los Alamos and Sandia National Laboratories provide for our national security. America invented these chips. We invented them. We went to the moon. We made them work better. We made them more sophisticated. But over time, we went from producing nearly 40% of those chips, the world's chips, down to 10%. That's why I designated and I signed, and I insisted that it be written and passed, the Chips and Science Act, exactly almost 1 year ago today, very short.
Now, this is the dilemma which we have. This is the dilemma which we have. The people are clapping, but it is the same people they will send around Africa and the global south to start lecturing to Africans how they should implement liberalism, liberalization, the private sector. The private sector is everything. Yet what we are seeing in broad daylight, the United States is practicing socialism and state capitalism, which it discourages the global south from doing. And as you have seen, he mentioned the CHIPS Act. And this Chips and Science Act, combined with the Inflation Reduction Act, they have helped them to push the inflation in the United States down from 9% to 3%. Okay, now let me go to the guy who crafted this policy for the Biden administration, and let us see what he's saying. Let us see what Jake Sullivan, who crafted this policy for the Biden administration, what he is saying. What is Jake Sullivan saying after being appointed as a national security advisor to Biden, someone actually who has come to take on, the advice, even the affairs of industrialization, the issue of industrialization. He gave a speech, and this speech has been published on the White House, website, because it is a very important speech. And if you look at it, it shows exactly what the Biden administration is doing. So he is saying that after the Second World War, the United States led a fragmented world to build a new international economic order. It lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It sustained thrilling technological revolutions, and it helped the United States and many other nations around the world to achieve levels of prosperity. Now, when he's talking about nations around the world, of course, he's talking about Europe. If you remember, the United States gave Europe a package which was called the Marshall Plan. And Europe after World War II had become devastated. So this is what he's talking about. So when the United States and its European allies talk about the whole world, the international community, they mean themselves. They are not meaning anyone else. They exist in that world only themselves. And of course, this goes on to confirm what was written in the United States Constitution, that Africans were 3/5 of a human being. They were only 60% of a human being. They were not full human beings. And so this explains their attitude actually also towards Africa today, that they think that they are supposed to patronize us. They always take on a patronizing attitude, a paternalistic attitude, that they think they are supposed to tell us what to do. So, but he is saying this is what he's saying. But the last few decades have revealed cracks in those foundations, the foundations which he's talking about, which the United States built. A shifting global economy left many working Americans and their communities behind. A financial crisis shook the middle class. A pandemic exposed the fragility of our supply chains. And of course, he's talking about the industries which left the United States. These are supply chains that he's talking about. The industries left the United States and went to Asia. And of course, this was because of the greed of the owners of these industries. And you can talk about General Electric, of course. People like Jack Welch. These are the people who took the industries from the United States and took them because they wanted to make cheap profit. They want to make quick profit. So a changing climate threatened lives and livelihoods. And of course, they want to blame Russia also for their problems. But majorly, the problem has been the mismanagement of the American economy by not only themselves, the government, but also the capitalists, the greed. So he's saying at this moment demands that we forge a new consensus. What is he saying? That is why the United States under Biden is pursuing a modern industrial and innovation strategy, both at home and with partners around the world. Remember, I told you that when the United States talks about partners around the world, he's talking about Europe, he's talking about Australia, he's talking about Canada. They do not include the rest of the people in the world as human beings. They do not include them as stakeholders in that world. And that is why you see this is reflected even in the voting on the United Nations Security Council. They have refused to reform the United Nations Security Council, the United Nations itself. For the last 60 years, since 1960, people like Dr. Kwame Nkrumah have been asking the reform of the United Nations. 1960, after the United States and Europe participated in the killing of Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba in the Democratic Republic of Congo, together with their evil organizations like the CIA. They participated in destroying Africa. Okay, so that is the period. Now, they have refused since then to reform the United Nations. They have refused to reform the IMF. They have refused to reform the World Bank. And these are people who talk about human rights. These are the people who talk about human rights. So he's saying that is why the United States government under Biden is pursuing a modern industrial innovation strategy, both at home and with our partners around the world. So this so-called modern industrial and innovation strategy is what Jake Sullivan suggested to Biden, which is the Inflation Reduction Act and which is the Chips and Science Act, which is to give these companies which are manufacturing chips, this technology and the renewable energy subsidies so that they can bring back factories to the United States. And of course, this is not very good for Africa. If industries go back to the United States, this is very bad for Africa. It is not good for Africa and all the other countries which have not yet developed. And I will do a video on that so that I can explain it deeper. But it is not good for the other countries of the world which have not yet developed. So now he's saying, this is what he's saying. This is what he's saying. They are setting a strategy, one that invests in the sources of our economic and technological strength, that promotes diversified and resilient global supply chains, that sets high standards for everything from labor and the environment to trusted technology and governance, and that deploys capital to deliver on public goods like climate and health. So he's talking about clean energy. When he's talking about climate, he's talking about everything from labor, high standards for labor. He's talking about jobs for the United States, because in Jake Sullivan's speeches, the recurring theme is for the United States to integrate its middle class, which has been almost wiped out by the industrialization, which is started, by the group of the Jack Welch, who was leading General Electric, to integrate the middle class of the United States with the global economy, or anywhere on the globe where the United States is engaged in exploiting. So now he's saying this. Now, the idea, so what he's saying is this. Now, this strategy will build a fairer, more durable world economic order. Of course, they still want to stay on top of the world. This is what we are seeing. Now, let me go to the part where he is talking about, all right. So he's saying that the vision, this is where it gets interesting. This is where really it gets interesting. Look at what, this is the point. This is the point. This is exactly the point that I wanted to make. Look at this. The vision of public investment. Now, we are talking about state investment. That is what the one he's talking about. The vision of public investment that had energized the American project in the post-war years, and indeed for much of our history, had faded. Okay? Actually, he's acknowledging that it has faded, this vision. He's acknowledging that public investment, the state, it is the one which energized the American project in the post-war years. And indeed, for much of our history, for much of America's history, this man is acknowledging what Professor Ha-Joon Chang is talking about, that the United States, for much of its history, was led by state capitalism. And of course, you can go on and talk about slavery. Slavery was legislated in the United States Constitution, in Congress. It was legislated, and Africans in the United States Constitution were called 3/5 of a human being, and they were called property. So this is the state capitalism that the United States used. It did not develop out of private enterprise. That's not what the United States did. When the whites were coming from Europe to the United States, they were being given free land. Free land. This is what was given to whites from Europe to the United States. And labor was legislated by the United States. Free labor, which was the African labor, and catching slaves and killing them and torturing them until they produced. So this is what Jake Sullivan is saying, the vision of public investment that had energized the American project in the post-war years, and indeed for much of our history, has faded. It had given away a set of ideas. Now listen to this. He's talking about Reagan. He's coming to talk about Reagan. Now, that because this came in the 80s with the Reagan regime and Margaret Thatcher, it had given way. This dream had faded in the 80s. It had given way. Now he's using had faded because he's trying to revive it. He's trying to revive the state capitalism in the United States, the state-led growth. This is what he's trying to revive. It had given way to a set of ideas that championed the tax cutting and deregulation. These are the things which they have been telling us. Deregulation, privatization, over public, deregulation, privatization over public action, and trade liberalization as an end in itself. Now he's criticizing the same things that they are pumping in our throats. Okay? He's saying that the vision of private investment, which had led the United States for most of its history, had faded, and it had given way to a set of ideas that championed the tax cutting, of course, for the rich, majorly for the rich, deregulation, okay, leaving them to operate how they want, free, no regulation, private over public action, that the state was replaced by private action, and trade liberalization as the end in itself, as an end in itself. There was an assumption. Listen to where he's going. Listen to where he's going. Now, I want you to listen very carefully. Listen to where Jake Sullivan is going. Remember, this is the national security advisor of Joe Biden, of the United States government, of President Joe Biden of the United States, and the architect of his industrial policy that they are implementing right now. Listen to what he's saying. There was an assumption at the heart of all of this policy that markets always allocate capital productively and effectively, no matter what our competitors did. no matter how big our shared challenges grow, and no matter how many quadrillions we took down. Now, no one, certainly not me. Listen, now he's apologizing, but he's still sticking to his point. No one, certainly not me, is discounting the power of the markets. Listen to this. So he's throwing all this rubbish that has been pushed on Africa by the World Bank and the IMF. He's throwing it, when it comes to the United States economy, he's throwing it under the bus. He's throwing it to the rubbish. So now here is apologizing, but he's going to stick to the point. No one, certainly not me, is discounting the power of the markets. But in the name of oversimplified, listen to what he's saying. But in the name of oversimplified market efficiency, entire supply chains of strategic goods, along with the industries and jobs that made them, moved overseas. And you remember what Joe Biden has been saying, bringing back industries and factories to the United States. So they are now throwing away what they are pushing in Africa and the global South. And they are saying that no, privatization, it doesn't work. The markets don't work. The state has to intervene. And like I said, the dilemma for Africa and the global South is that the state in Africa has been weakened, and the African heads of state have been brainwashed. It is like a song. They have become parrots. The private sector, the private sector, the private sector. You have heard President Museveni, you will hear President Ramaphosa, you will hear President Nana Akufo-Addo, the private sector. These people have weakened the African state in favor of the private sector. Which private sector is being thrown under the bus? By the godfather of so-called privatization and liberalization. This is the problem. This is the problem. This is the problem. So he's saying that the industries, our industries moved overseas. They moved overseas. And he continues to say, and the postulate that deep trade liberalization would help America export goods, not jobs and capacity, was a promise made but not kept. You see, he's saying that it doesn't work. This is a promise that the so-called state capitalism made, the so-called privatization, liberalization made, but it doesn't work. Its promises were not fulfilled in the United States. Now, this is happening amidst our heads of state in Africa continuing to hang on this false gospel called liberalization and privatization. Now, he continues. Another embedded assumption was the type of growth, was that the type of growth did not matter. All growth was good growth. So various reforms combined and came together. So various reforms combined and came together to privilege some sectors of the economy like finance, while other essential sectors like semiconductors and infrastructure atrophied. Okay, so the infrastructure was neglected, semiconductor was neglected, and then finance was glorified. And this is what we see even in Africa. Our financial sector majorly has been given over to the West. This is the financialization of the economy. Our industrial capacity, which is crucial to any country's ability to continue to innovate, took a real hit. This is what he's saying. Where's the industrialization in Africa? Since the 1970s, 1960s, in the 1960s, we had captured 7% of industrial capacity across the globe. Today, our industrial capacity across the globe compared to the globe, the percentage of our industrialization compared to the globe is 5%. It has reduced. Now, Jake Sullivan is saying that industrial capacity, which is crucial to any country's ability to continue to innovate, took a real hit because of privatization. And he's saying that the shocks of a global financial crisis and a global pandemic laid bare the limits of these prevailing assumptions. He has rubbished everything about privatization, private capital, private sector. He has rubbished it completely. He has rubbished it. Okay? He has rubbished it. So, what is now coming to, what Jake Sullivan is coming to, is that he has recognized that they have to go back. He has to go back. The United States has to go back to state capitalism. The United States has to go back to state-led growth. But this is the same state-led growth which they have been criticizing when it comes to China. And now, this is where I'm saying that this false gospel that has been preached to us for a long time by these people, we need to discard it. And the older generation of African heads of state, they are way below that understanding right now. We need to take a different direction. And that is why the Africa Continental Unity Party, to which I belong, and Connect Africa are working together to bring this new reality, to bring this new Africa, to bring this reorganized Africa, which we have said that we are reorganizing three major areas of the continent. And currently we are looking for all those people who are willing to work with us. Reach out to us and let us work together so that we can build that new Africa. So that we can build that new Africa. And I say that we have a couple of sectors that we have a couple of sectors that we are going to reorganize, and there are three. One, the most important resource on the African continent is Africa's resources. All Africa's educated people across the globe, they have to come back and rebuild Africa and help to rebuild Africa. We are going to reorganize Africa's most important resource, and that is Africa's people, which will produce for us Africa's market of 1.4, and including the diaspora, up to 1.7 billion Africans. That is a market that we are going to reorganize. This same population will produce for us the literacy rate that is enough to drive Africa's rapid industrialization in the next 20 years. We have set ourselves that we want to do this in the next 20 years once we have captured and unify the African continent as a whole. Once we are in power as the Africa Continental Unity Party, governing the whole African continent, that is our purpose. That is what we are working to do right now. Number one, most important resource, that's the population, Africa's population, to produce the 75% literacy rate, which we have currently right now, more than 75% literacy rate. And then the market. Number two, we have a GDP of $3.5 trillion. This is enough capital for us to function without anyone giving us aid. This is enough capital for Africa to operate without anyone giving us aid. $3.5 trillion. This makes Africa the 6th or the 5th biggest economy in the world. Number three, that is the material resources. This is all we need. And we are asking for your support as Africans in this process, so that you can come and work with us, come and support us in this process, so that we can build together the new Africa that we all desire, that we all deserve as Africans, so that we can stop the exploitation of Africa's resources. We need to stop the exploitation of Africa's resources. We need to stop the exploitation of Africa's resources. That is the bottom line. Now, reach out to us. The numbers to contact are down in the comment section. You can write a message. We can respond back to you. But the numbers are down on the scroller. You can see them right here. You can see the numbers over here. You know, as they are scrolling, you can see the email, Connect Africa, the email is there. You can write to us and let's have this conversation, because this generation has to do something about our continent. It has been me Kwame Gonza from Connect Africa, Africa Continental Unity Party, dispelling the false narrative and the lies that are being planted and being spread by the United States of liberalization and privatization and the private sector as the leading sector that is supposed to grow the economy, while at home they are practicing state capitalism. Thank you very much. My name is Kwame Gonza once again, and Africa must unite. Thank you very much. I'm out of here.